Easter hymns really are glorious, and rightly so. This is the biggest feast day of the Christian calendar, in which the whole faith kind of comes together and makes sense. Without it, it's kind of meaningless. Christ is alive, let Christians sing, right? This is our triumphant holy day. I'll spare you my actual singing. And perhaps because of the hymns and our acquaintance with the outcomes of the story, we have a tendency to glide over the kind of terror of the first day. We leave the terror at Good Friday. But interestingly, in the Gospels, the word terror never occurs, and the word afraid never really occurs in conjunction with the Good Friday stories. Not until Jesus actually dies. But terror and afraid, those are pieces of the Easter story. And there's no better story to remind us of that than the story from Mark's Gospel. Most of the time on Sunday, we read John's Gospel, but Mark's is assigned for today. And perhaps we don't want to read it because amidst the resounding bells and the major chords of our Easter hymns, Mark's kind of ending where the women are afraid and they run away and they don't tell anybody doesn't quite fit. But for a moment, for the next couple paragraphs, forget what you know about the story and just sit in the emotional space of that first Easter for a moment. Imagine that you're there in the pre-dawn light, and it's you who's just schlepped a bunch of spices to anoint the body of someone you love, who you just watched be executed, who you just watched die, and whose death hasn't even begun to become real to you. You're not over it. You don't know how to grieve it. The best you can do is go anoint his body. And so approaching the garden, you see in the hillside a really dark hole, a yawning blackness, and you realize that that's the tomb, which means the rock has been rolled away, and you pick up your pace. I mean, there's one problem solved, you can easily get in, but more problems raised. Who moved it? And what about the body inside? Will it still be there? And so you arrive and your suspicions are confirmed. The rock is to the side and the tomb is open. And so you step inside. It's dark. Your eyes slowly begin to adapt, and to your horror, Jesus is not where he is supposed to be laid. And your heart begins to pound. But then it gets worse because you suddenly sense in a growing awareness that you are not alone in the tomb. And the chill glides up your spine and suffuses out into your limbs. And you summon all the courage you have to turn around, and you're correct. There's a young man sitting on the ledge opposite you. And now it's genuine panic. And he seems so calm, and he's talking to you, but you can't assimilate the words. Because now the chill has turned to heat, and the sweat is real, and your heart is pounding. And given the choice between fight or flight, you choose flight. And so you race out of the tomb and down the hill, going faster than you're sure you've ever gone since you were a child. And eventually you reach the friendly avenues of the city, and you slow, and kind of bend over to heave some breath, and begin to walk slowly. And as you do so and calm down, his words begin to bounce in your brain. He's not here. He is risen. He is gone to Galilee. And you realize the man stated them like obvious facts, but they're far from it. The only obvious thing is that Jesus is missing, and that's horrifying. And as you think about the horror, it dawns on you that the young man seemed surprisingly upbeat about the entire situation. He is risen. Well, that's a funky grammatical kind of way of putting it. Done that way, in the passive voice, it sounds like someone raised Jesus, that he didn't do it himself. So who was that? And then you shudder, because is this the power of God, or is this some more nefarious power at work? And he's gone ahead to Galilee, like his home, like where his ministry started? And you're supposed to tell the disciples You decide the only obvious thing about this is that you will not be telling the disciples because those men are already scared stiff. They're already in a really dark place and they don't need this. Besides, what would you say? It's so murky. It's so unclear. Jesus is gone. That's the only clear thing. But just as your mind registers the thought, it registers also that there's another possibility. And the other possibility is this: Jesus is no longer dead. And you come to a full stop. Because if that's true, then the body isn't missing per se. Because the body isn't just a body, it's actually whatever makes a person alive in itself. And when you think about it, Jesus did say he was going to die, but you just didn't want to believe that. And Jesus did claim to have a pretty unique relationship with God, called him Father. And that was pretty different too. So maybe he is risen is God's doing. He is risen by the power of God, reaching into death. But then that's resurrection. And you know that resurrection doesn't happen until the last day when God will raise everyone up. So is the last day today? And if Jesus is risen, then he must be risen with new life, not just resuscitated. Death must have no power over him. That is a new thing, a totally new thing. And a shudder kind of passes through you. But this time it's not terror, it's amazement. He is risen. Has God turned death inside out? That means nothing is the same. And maybe it holds power for you and for the disciples and for everyone you know, but it's too much to speak of. The words catch in your throat. The amazement brings you to silence. Amazement and terror. They're the dominant words in Mark's story. But interestingly, for our Greek writers, they're actually one word. And they occur twice in the passage. That it is somewhat terrifying that first Easter to think about what God has actually done. The power of God to overturn death, to bring life, to flip death inside out so that nothing is ever the same again. That's a kind of power that has a little bit of a terror in it. But then it easily turns to, maybe not easily, but then it turns to amazement, considering that God exercises such power to bring life, to turn death inside out, to make the abyss an empty set, so that nothing is the same. This isn't reanimation. This is resurrection. This is the Spirit of God making a new thing, bringing about the end of time into the present, in which resurrection, it's a possibility for all of us. You see, the gift of Mark's strange story, the gospel that seems truncated, like it leaves out the ending, is that it really asks us to sit in the original Easter. We know the story, most of us. We know from the hymns how it turns out, our triumphant day. But to sit in the original story, to feel the amazement and the terror sink in, is to maybe come to a new understanding of resurrection, to have it sit in our soul in a different way. And maybe it causes us to sing the hymns from the hills, or maybe it brings about such an amazed silence that we kind of understand where the women are coming from. That the power of God is so awesome, that God has done such a good new thing, it's indescribable. What words could we use to talk about it? That's the gift of Mark's story. Just sit in it, so that the Easter story becomes new in a real way, that it drops into a different place and it holds us. And we realize Jesus is who he said he was, and that God has overturned the power of death. And that while perfect resurrection isn't a possibility now, the promise of living into it is. Because God has said no to death, life is possible in places we never imagined. Life is possible in places we think dead. And that begins now, and it's a promise for all eternity. And that is good news. Amazing, for sure. Alleluia, Christ is risen. The Lord is risen indeed.